Hey everyone. Before we start, if you enjoy my videos, please leave a like. It's the only way the algorithm will notice me. So, Hollow Knight's cut content. I'm sure everyone has seen the Lake of Bones and the Snail Village, but if Team Cherry took these amazing areas out of the game, it begs the question, what else didn't make the cut? I did some digging on my own, and I think I found something pretty amazing. There were a few charms that didn't make it, some NPCs who were cut out, even a couple of boss fights that had some initial planning done, but ultimately weren't implemented in the game. These were cool and all, but then I stumbled upon the holy grail of cut content. In a folder hidden away in the game's files was a treasure trove of cut dialogue, some of which have insane implications for the lore, while others are just plain funny. So without further ado, let's see what secrets were almost in Hollow Knight, and how this information could have changed the game as we know it. Let's start with the silly stuff. First off is the quote I used in the thumbnail. It looks like at one point Cloth might have been a little more aware of what would happen if she interacted with the knight too much. Wow, I want to be brave too. I'll save you later on, then die. As well as, I can't wait to die later on. I'm not sure why exactly these were even considered in the first place. Maybe it was an inside joke from the developers about the ultimate fate of Cloth. Pretty clear why it was cut from the final game. Next up is everyone's favorite senior citizen, Elderbug. This quote seems like it would have been said upon meeting the player for the first time. If you do meet my fellows down there, you might remind them of their poor elder, up here, back aching, abandoned to his lonesome vigil. Poor, poor me. Oh, I'm fine, really, but a bit of guilt might go some way in persuading their return. Assuming they're still alive, that is. Maybe TC felt this was just too passive-aggressive for Elderbug? Who knows? Personally, I think it fits his character just fine. The little fool from the Colosseum also has a bit of cut dialogue. What is this? I could have sworn you already entered the fray, and were killed in spectacular fashion, but now, I can't be sure. Must have imagined it. I do tend to visualize new combatants meeting their end. It's good training for the mind, especially whilst your movement's somewhat limited. I'm curious as to why they cut this one. It's a neat bit of environmental storytelling for an NPC to see the knight's seeming immortality and react to it. The only thing I could think of is that no one else in the game mentions the knight being unable to die, and making the little fool privy to this fact didn't quite fit the narrative. Of all the characters that had cut dialogue, I did not expect Gorb to be among them. Greetings, pale thing. Do you seek my knowledge? That I cannot give, only an end. Would you accept the end I offer? I have no clue what this could possibly reference. Perhaps Gorb, being as smart and all-knowing as he claims to be, would have been privy to some knowledge to help the knight? Maybe there's a secret cut Gorb-related ending. Not too far-fetched, considering Mr. Mushroom also had his own, but maybe 2 random NPC endings was too much for TC. Okay, as promised, the heavy stuff. Let's start out with the Grim Troop. Divine has a few lines of cut dialogue, but one of them stands out from the others. Ah, then the ritual is complete? And the Master has moved on? Has he? Perhaps not? Ah, but more for me. Still more I can do. Gifts so lovely. Master would understand. Clearly, this quote was supposed to be after the player defeats Nightmare King Grim and the troop leaves Dartmouth. She also pretty heavily hints that he may not have left, but transformed into the final form of the Grim Child, his will carried on in the cycle of the Grim Troop. I can understand wanting to keep this tidbit more ambiguous in the final game. Speaking of keeping things ambiguous, Lemaire at one point had some things to say to the knight if they were to show up to her hut bearing something. Lemaire takes that heavy mantle. Shay wouldn't wish it upon anyone. Having served that brand at its great height, Shay knows well what suffering it brings. Enough to turn Nim King to flee or fair knights to mourning. Looks to me that Team Cherry wanted to leave the Grey Mourner's past more to the player to uncover, rather than her telling the knight herself. Clearly she's talking about the king's brand, but why would the king run away from his own power? Maybe this was a little too ambiguous. Next up, the Dreamers. A common theme among these quotes is that the player might have been able to speak to the Dreamers normally, or perhaps they're just extra dialogue trees for when they're dream-nailed. Who knows? Firstly, Hera. For some reason, she got the short end of the stick as she has several less cut lines than the other Dreamers. Well, I guess that wouldn't be the short end, but you know what I mean. Worm, your attempt may prove futile, but your offer I could not refuse. For my daughter and my kind, I became bond upon the vessel. For her, I would give it all. A few of these quotes only expand on what we already know from the main game. Hera and her tribe never really accepted the Pale King's rule, choosing instead to stay hidden in their corner of Hallownest. She only agreed to become a dreamer after bargaining for a child in exchange, which ended up being Hornet. The first quote piqued my interest, though, where she seems to be speaking directly to the Pale King. It's confusing because in the first half she's speaking in the present tense, and then in the second she's speaking in the past. The only ways that could make sense are A, Hera is talking to the king about striking the deal for Hornet in a flashback, or B, she's speaking to the player, which wouldn't really make a lot of sense. Unless... Yeah, no, probably nothing. Next up is Lurien. That black choice made, but not by me. Our king claimed that burden. My lot is easier, only to sleep and to serve. Our king appears as Bug, and I shall take him as so, but his are traits that transcend our kind. His is a mind beyond ours. Deity given form. In sleep, I shall not look upon his like again. Remember our promise, sister. We three vowed to protect the seal with all of our devotion. Remember our bond, our sacrifice, for the kingdom's sake, for the one we must protect. It's pretty clear at one point that TC wanted the Dreamers to have more dialogue with each other, but ended up opting for keeping their interactions to only impeding the Knight's progress. I also like the quote about the black choice, possibly referring to the King's experiments with vessels in the void. Or maybe he's referring to the Pale King forcing the Radiance into his child. We'll never know. Finally, Monomon, who had the most cut dialogue of any of the Dreamers. We sealed that plague and thought we'd find an answer, but we were wrong. Our sacrifices. What did they win us? A world sealed in stasis. Only one path I see. The seals must break. Will it bring destruction? Of course. It will bring change, too. Let it. To live forever in an unchanging world. Death, I would fear less. Open your minds, brother and sister. Our vow was to protect. But do we? The vessel weakens. To sleep eternal. What difference from death? So, we found each other after all. Can you see me here in this forgotten dream? I can see only light. We fought against you too, struggling against our fate. The light we caged away. It is alive, and we are not. Is that what draws you to it? This is pretty insane. If you didn't believe that the Dreamers were going to speak directly to the player before, you sure do now. We knew from the main game that Monomon is the only Dreamer that actively tells the Knight to break the seals, but it looks like Team Cherry wanted her to have a more active stance at one point. There's also more hints at an argument between the three Dreamers. I also like the line, "I can see only light," implying that in their sleep the Dreamers are blinded by the radiance, constantly being reminded of their failed plan, but unable to wake up. Next, let's take a look at the Hollow Knight itself. It used to have Dreamnail dialogue of its own. Kill. Shall blaze free. This vessel, broken, fails. Dawn shall break. No mind the usurper, only strength. Kill the usurper. Our light it would suffocate. Father? Whoa now. I know we joked about this theory earlier, but come on. Unless the Hollow Knight is in his death throes reminiscing about the Pale King, this line would have some pretty serious implications. If only it were canon. Speaking of the Pale King, he also has some cut dialogue, albeit only a single line. False one, you cannot reach me here. I assume he's talking about the Radiance, but where is here? The only place we find the Pale King is where we stumble upon his corpse in the dream of one of his knights. It's also interesting that he'd be actively hiding from the Radiance. Maybe he could sense that the Hollow Knight was unable to contain its infection somehow? Food for thought. The final bit of cut dialogue I want to share with you all comes from the White Lady. Two halves of a whole. You found your way. Back to me? We were so unfair, weren't we? To cast you out? Please, you must not hate him. He did what he thought was right. The kingdom had to live. This was a pretty big decision on Team Cherry's part. In the lore, there's a gap in our knowledge on what we know about the Knight, starting in the Abyss during the Void Heart cutscene and ending at the beginning of the game. We have no idea how the Knight managed to escape the Abyss after it was sealed away by the Pale King, and even less so how they managed to leave Hallownest in its entirety only to come back at the beginning of the game. You may not have found it, but if you try to leave Hallownest yourself on the Howling Cliffs, you're constantly blown back by incredibly heavy winds, unable to move past them. Here, it seems that Team Cherry had a plan to have the Pale King and the White Lady send the Knight away on purpose. Although for what reasons they could have had to do so, we can't say. Personally, I prefer the mystery as it is now. And that's all the interesting cut dialogue I could find. I hope you all enjoyed. If you have any theories of your own as to what Team Cherry might have wanted to do with this content, leave them in the comments. I'd love to see your ideas. I didn't list all the cut dialogue here. There's some that I left out as it wasn't interesting and or served no purpose. For example, there's cut dialogue for Mr. Mushroom and some other shroom entities, but it's in Shroomal language, and since I sadly can't equip Spore Shroom in real life to decipher it, I decided best to leave it alone. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this look into what might have been, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye!